After entering a monster-filled palace unknowingly, the monster transformed her brother into someone else, and her body became his. Here, when Ray went to him with food, Cloden came out to her with his hands injured and refused to let her enter. And here, Ray said to her, "Why are you shouting? You're hurt, Cloden. Are you hiding something?" And Cloden was tense. "What?" And suddenly, Ray dropped the plate of food from her hands. Then in shock, she started crying and saying to herself, "What did I just do?" And here Cloden looked at the broken plate and said to himself, "It's dangerous." Then he said to Ray, "It's okay, Ray. I'm sorry." And Ray screamed in a breakdown and said to him, "I didn't mean to be a burden on you. I didn't mean to bother you." And she was about to leave. But Cloden said to her, "Wait, Ray. I must be busy. I'm sorry." But Cloden shouted. On her, Ray said, "And you should go back to what you were doing. I'll leave then." But Cloden grabbed her arm and said, "Ray!" Then he shouted in her face, "I didn't say you're annoying. Don't repeat that again." And Ray, tense, said, "Okay, I'll leave. You should get back to work." And here Cloden looked at her angrily and then said to her, "Are you running away from me?" And Ray, surprised, said, "Run away? I'll ask the housekeepers to sweep up the broken glass." But Cloden grabbed her tightly and said, "Ray, I don't care if you raise your voice at me or even get mad at me, but when you try to walk away from me, it drives me crazy. My head hurts like it's going to explode." And Ray looked at him in shock and said, "I just didn't want to bother you because you seemed busy." And Cloden replied, "I'm the one who made you feel that way, so why are you apologizing then?" Then he sighed and said to her, "I'm known for my temper, especially when I'm working." Cloden whispered to himself, "That's why no one comes near me when I'm working." Then he said to her in a loud voice, "You know I'm a good-for-nothing jerk, right? You pity me, don't you?" Ray was shocked and said, "What? Don't say that. You can be the sweetest person on earth. Not only that, but you always encourage me to do my best. You have no idea how much that helps me." And Cloden looked at her and said, "Okay, then because I like you." And here Ray asked him, "So does that mean your liking for me is likely to diminish?" Cloden replied, "What do you have to worry about me falling deeper in love with you?" Then he pulled her closer to him and said, "You can't even get out of bed yet." And Ray said, "Really? You'll never change, will you?" And Cloden, tense, said, "Ray, you're acting a bit strange today." And Ray couldn't respond, then said to him, "I'm sorry. Are you okay?" And Cloden looks at his injury and Ray says, "That hurts." Cloden replies, "It hurts because I touched it." Then Cloden approaches her and says, "I want you to treat my wound." Ray treats his wound and Cloden looks at her and says, "You're beautiful today." Ray is stunned and turns to look away. Cloden asks, "Did you dress up just for me?" Then he takes her hair in his hands and looks at it, saying, "Ray, just as you want to be beautiful in front of me." Then he smells her hair and says, "There's a side of me I don't want to show you." Ray turns to him suddenly and says, "But I'm still disappointed and I want to be by your side, Cloden, no matter what state you're in." Then Ray looks down and says, "I'm afraid you'll change, Cloden. What if you end up not liking me anymore?" Cloden laughs suddenly and Ray looks at him in astonishment. Cloden takes her hand and whispers, "You think I won't like you anymore? How could you even think such nonsense? That will never happen." Then Cloden looks into her eyes and says, "I'm the one who should ask you not to change." Ray remembers her childhood, which started with attention, and then that attention diminished from her parents' side. She says, "But, Cloden, every other person in my life has changed." Cloden is stunned as Ray leans on his shoulder and says, "My love was always one-sided, and I thought it would be that way for the rest of my life. But you reciprocated my feelings for the first time." And when he finished, he looked at her in astonishment. Ray continued, and she said, "This has never happened before." Ray's hand is shaking, and she says, "Then why should I change?" And when she said to him, "I love you, Cloden, so don't ever change." Cloden looked at her and felt the curse that had become her possession. Then he hugged her in relief, saying to himself, "A curse I never want to be free from." And the scene changes to the castle garden, where Ray is looking at the flowers in amazement and says, "These blue flowers are especially big. Will they get bigger? Where's the gardener? He was always here in the afternoon." And when she found him, she went to him and said happily, "Excuse me, sir, I would like to ask you a favor." And when he said, "The blue roses, oh my," Ray looked at him in astonishment, because it turned out to be her brother who had changed his appearance into someone else and was given the name John. And he said to her, "Don't you agree, Miss Lisbon?" And Ray whispered to herself, "I thought he was the gardener. He calls me by my last name, but everyone calls me Lady Ray." Then she said to him, "Hello, John." But John pursed his lips in anger and said, "Humans," and gripped a rose in his hands, saying, "Ordinary humans cannot create something like this." Ray was shocked by his reaction and said to him, "What are you doing? Haze?" Because blue roses don't exist in reality, and maybe a monster could create something like this. Suddenly, the gardener appeared and hit Hayes on the head with his shoe. Ray looked at him in shock, and suddenly the gardener attacked Hayes again. Ray said, "Mr. Gardener!" The gardener looked at her in shock and said to himself, "Did she find out?" And he remembered Hayes's words to her, "Ordinary humans cannot create something like this because blue roses don't exist in reality, and maybe a monster could create something like this." And he said to himself, "I or we are already monsters, and these blue roses are fake too." And Ray was shocked, so he looked at her and said, "No, it's real." Hayes laughed and said, "Oh, you fool! You think I don't know what kind of tricks you're playing." When Hayes said, "You won't fool anyone," the gardener hit him. And now the scene changes to the servant who looked at his watch and said to Cloden, who was making a key with his magic, "Sir, it's time for your medicine." "For why?" And Cloden replied, "I'm sick of everything. The side effects of the curse, my lord, grow stronger when the moon is full." And the servant said to himself nervously, "But it's too early. It's not even a full moon yet. Maybe it's because he used a lot of magic. But I'm glad we have the medicine to calm his anger. Maybe he made this medicine because of Lady Ray. If she hadn't been here, blood would have already been spilled in this castle. I hope it stays that way." And Mr. Cloden threw the key to the servant and said, "Philip, take it." The servant looked at him, and Cloden put his hand on his head and said, "Keep it in a safe place. If you close the door with this key, you can get out from the inside, but no one will be able to enter the room from the outside, and this will keep Ray safe. Remember, when I give you the signal, close the door." And suddenly there was a knock on his door. Cloden said, "Enter." And the maid, Mary, entered and said, "Sir, I think you should see this. Lady Ray." After she told him, Cloden became angry and broke his medicine glass. He went to Ray, who looked at him in shock and said, "Cloden." He approached her angrily and grabbed her, saying, "Ray, did you get into a fight?" The gardener replied, "No, sir. Jack stopped them before things got worse." Cloden, still angry, said to Ray, "Why were you with those scumbags?" Ray said, "Huh? I thought I might be able to help, so I went out." And when Cloden got even angrier and said, "What?" Ray smiled nervously, and she said, "I mean, it would be nice to help with something around the castle. Everyone is always busy." But Cloden gripped her hands tightly and said, "There's no need for that. I never want you to touch the dirt. And if you ever do, I'll cut off their wrists." Ray was shocked by his reaction and said, "What?" And Cloden said, "The same goes for everything else. There's no need to do anything. I told you I want to give you the best of everything." And Ray said nervously, "You treat me like a princess. You say I can be as lazy as I want and do whatever I want? Cloden smiled and said to her, Yes, I love to hear that. But Ray looked at him nervously and said to herself, But what if he doesn't love me anymore? Then she remembered his words when he said to her, Do you think I won't love you anymore? How can you think such nonsense? And she said to herself, Cloden promised me he would never change. But I don't know where I stand. I need some kind of commitment. That way I can stay here even if Cloden's feelings change. Cloden woke her up and said, Ray. And she smiled and said, Okay. I was just outside so I could look at the flowers. I just happened to run into them. At the same time, she said to herself, I don't want to make this situation any worse. Plus, Cloden looks tired. Cloden said, What? You were looking at the flowers without me? Ray said, You were busy, Cloden. I'll be sure to ask next time. Now let's go inside. Cloden looked at the servant and whispered to him, Make sure they get the proper training. Then he left with Ray.